It was a dark day in 2006 when everyone's celestial darling Pluto was demoted from planethood. But what is the definition of a planet exactly? And does that definition make any sense? Let's explore that question together. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. The most famous part of this controversy is in August of 2006 when the International Astronomical Union, the IAU, decided in Prague with a vote that there should be a definition of what a planet is and of what a dwarf planet is. Let me tell you what that definition is, as voted on. A planet is a celestial body which 1. is in orbit around the Sun, 2. has sufficient mass to assume hydrostatic equilibrium, a nearly round shape, and 3. has cleared the neighborhood around its orbit. So let's break this down. So again, number 1, a planet is in orbit around the Sun, and it's round, and it has cleared the neighborhood around its orbit. That's the definition that was voted on. Now, I have quite a few problems with that. One problem that a lot of people had with it at the time was that it meant that Pluto is no longer a planet. And many of us grew up learning 9 planets in the solar system, and they're all hurt that Pluto's not a planet anymore. Now, as for me, I'm not that worried about whether or not Pluto fits the definition of planethood or not. I'm more interested in how stupid this definition is, which we will explore, and also why it was done in the first place. Now, the reason that a vote on the definition of a planet seemed to become necessary in 2006 was that the year prior, Mike Brown, an astronomer, discovered in 2005 the planet that we call Eris, which is Greek for discord. Great name. And Eris is about the same size as Pluto, and yet it's farther out there. It's out in a region that we call the Kuiper Belt. And from Pluto out quite a distance to about 50 astronomical units. An astronomical unit is the distance on average from the Earth to the Sun, about 150 million kilometers. And in the past couple of decades, we've discovered many objects out in that region, including 2 other worlds, which are now called dwarf planets, and their names are Haumea and Makemake. So a primary motivation for this vote on a definition was that there is a class of objects out there in the Kuiper Belt which are icy bodies and not quite like the terrestrial bodies, not like the gas giants. So the idea was, okay, let's have a new definition. One of the other motivations, though, was that, oh no, as we keep discovering these, there could be hundreds out there. And then there'll be so many planets. Oh, it'll be so difficult to teach children all the names of all the planets. This is just all kinds of absurdity, but these really are significant aspects of that process of why they wanted to create a definition. The definition here that I just read to you, that it's an orbit around the Sun, a planet is an orbit around the Sun, remember that, has sufficient mass to have a roughly spherical shape and has cleared the neighborhood around its orbit. All of that was put together in order to prevent Pluto from being in the class of planets. Not just Pluto, but also Eris and all these other objects out there, which are of similar size and probably similar composition. Now, if you've ever seen any images of Pluto, which was seen by the incredible New Horizons probe in its flyby of the Plutonian system in 2015, it is amazing. It is an incredibly dynamic, geologically dynamic world. It's a very, very interesting place. In some ways, it easily rivals Mars in how interesting, dynamic, and active it currently is. The primary investigator of the New Horizons mission, Alan Stern, was in fact questioned frequently after 2006. New Horizons was launched in 2006, and then a few months later, the IAU decided that, Pluto's not a planet anymore, okay? Unfortunately, this is a problem connected with scientific literacy. That is to say, it is, in a broad sense, a political problem. because scientific literacy, how the public deals with these questions related to science, is important because we have people who make decisions all around the world at the government level in order to create the funding, to find the funding for missions like New Horizons, which went to visit Pluto. Alan Stern, after the launch of New Horizons, after the changing definition of planet, was asked, oh, well, why are you sending this mission to Pluto now that it's not a planet anymore? And it's just like, really? I mean, and that's the problem. The problem is that the term planet is connected to something in the public conscience. What is a planet? What is a moon? And so forth. And of course, the reason for the vote on this, not even arbitrary definition, but we'll get to that, so that people wouldn't have to memorize the names of more than 9 or 10 or 12 planets, as if that's a really big issue. Why do they have to memorize the names of them to begin with? It's good if they know about them or they hear about them, but if there's dozens of planets in our own solar system, they certainly don't need to know them all. How many constellations can you name off the top of your head? Can you name all 50 states in the United States in order if you're from the United States? I mean, can you name all the countries in South America? Some of you probably can, but how important is that? It's probably more important to hear about them, know that they exist, understand something about them, rather than worry about being able to name each one.
When the world was quaint and our knowledge was limited, and we only knew of 9 planets, you could know all their names.
Yeah, exactly.
And then as the numbers grew, believe it or not, scientists, people who you think would respect data, started to say, oh, this will tarnish our reputation. You know, school children won't be able to remember it. And the International Astronomical Union freaked out in 2006 and said, nope, we're going to keep the number at 8. That's it. You know what I said in response? We're going to go back to 8 states now?
Yeah,
what?
exactly.
I mean, are we going to limit the periodic table to stop at beryllium?
So let's dissect this definition again. So say it one more time, because I can't keep a straight face when I say it. A planet is in orbit around the sun. Okay, let's discuss that. In orbit around the sun, well, that means that more than the 4,000 confirmed exoplanets outside of this solar system aren't planets. Oh, sorry, TRAPPIST-1 system. You're really awesome, but none of you are planets anymore since 2006. Sorry, the IAU has spoken. The next part of this. A planet has sufficient mass to assume a hydrostatic equilibrium, a nearly round shape. Okay, that's intuitive. But how do you measure that? What are the scientific definitions of that? This is a scientific definition, and it lacks basic definition. That's a problem. Number 3, a planet has cleared the neighborhood around its orbit. So what does that mean? Well, the reason again for this is to exclude Pluto and to exclude other Kuiper Belt large bodies like Eris, because Pluto and Eris and other worlds out there are a lot of other Kuiper Belt objects which are smaller in that range from the sun out to 58U, and because they're out there, they prevent Pluto and Eris from being planets. So the motivation was deliberately to exclude a certain potentially very long list of worlds we may discover out there from being planets, and just call them, they're just dwarf planets. And even that doesn't make any sense. Because last I checked, dwarf being an archaic and potentially offensive term for a little person, well, little people are still people, last I checked. But there's an issue, because cleared the neighborhood, not only is it undefined in this definition, it doesn't quite work, because Earth has not cleared the orbit either. There are near-Earth asteroids. And there are other asteroids around the other inner planets as well. Those orbits are not fully cleared. And even the largest world in the solar system, the super massive, beautiful, wonderful Jupiter, has Trojan asteroids, enormous numbers of them, which are, not only are they in the vicinity of Jupiter, they're right in the orbit of Jupiter. Now, the motivation for this cleared the neighborhood thing of other objects. The point of it is, again, to say, an object with as low a mass as Pluto isn't sufficient to clear its own orbit. Whereas an object like Jupiter, well, it hasn't cleared its orbit either. But it does have control over it, right? So the problem then emerges, because people have heard about this controversy and they've heard the complaint that, oh, well, it hasn't cleared its orbit. I'm not the first one to say that. But then they say in response, oh, well, except that there's a certain perturbation cycle of the near-Earth asteroids, and over million-year cycles, Earth is able to move them and manipulate them. And the Trojan asteroids around Jupiter are, of course, directly tied to the Lagrange points of Jupiter's gravity, so they're tied to the Jupiter gravity system, to the Jovian gravity system. Yes, but you, like the people trying to write the script for Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams, are trying to fill in the gaps left in those last two Star Wars sequels to try to make it all make sense. But it is not your job to come up with a better definition that isn't in the definition, just like it's, in fact, the job of the writers of screenplays to actually write the screenplay and not make the fans try to figure out what the heck is going on. So I criticize not only the definition itself for its complete lack of logic, I question the motivation of needing to exclude a certain group. Now, what's also interesting is that if you take certain bodies like, say, the Earth, and if somehow it could be moved to the outer solar system far enough away, well, it's not going to be able to clear its orbit anymore. And if you take a world, even as small as Pluto, close enough to the sun, it will be able to clear its orbit because of the perturbations and the dynamics of planets with their star. The definition as it stands means that there are no planets in the entire universe because it has to orbit the sun, it has to have cleared its orbit. And the other part about hydrostatic equilibrium, which is great, isn't even well defined. This isn't an arbitrary decision. An arbitrary vote would be to say, we are just going to say there are 8 planets and that the icy worlds beyond are dwarf planets. Of course, that doesn't include Ceres, which is a sizable and rather round world in the asteroid belt, which is called a dwarf planet, but that's besides the point. That would be an arbitrary decision. You just say, put up a line. If it's outside Neptune, then it's not a planet anymore. Of course, Neptune hasn't cleared its orbit either, because Pluto orbits inside of it for many years during its orbit. It's all just stupid. It is a dumb, stupid idiot of a definition. It is both scientifically dumb and linguistically idiotic. It doesn't make any sense. I think the motivation behind it is bad, and the language is bad. And this reminds me very much of what I discussed in my video about dialect versus language. Why are the language varieties of Italy not considered to be languages in their own right by, say, the Italian government? Why is that arbitrary definition maintained? Well, part of the reason is because if you call it a language, then it has this kind of importance. It's this kind of, I call it political. I mean political in a very broad sense, in the sense of how people interact with one another and how they regard and consider things. The public conscience, if you will. And in Scotland, too, the Scots language has been regarded as, a mere dialect of English, slang, not good enough to be considered a language. This is where terminology interacts with the political sensibility of the individual and of the group. If we call Catalan a language, as of course pretty much all of us will agree that it's a language and not merely a dialect, then it gets to have a certain influence. If we call Sardinian a language, then it gets to have a certain influence. If we call Neapolitan a language, it gets to have a certain influence. And this is very important, and I can understand why people would also not want to give those language varieties the definition of language, because that will have certain political, as I call them, consequences. And that's exactly what we see here with this vote in 2006 of what a planet should be. It's arbitrary. It's not even arbitrary. Arbitrary, you set up a line, say, that's it. And it's either a logical one or an illogical one, but it has clear lines. This isn't even arbitrary because it discludes every single world out there, including this one, from even being a planet. And it is an enormous shame that so many people have decided to invest this faith in the IAU and just accept that this definition is scientifically sensible, because it's not. This seems like something that was written by scientifically illiterate people. Nor do I criticize people who don't yet have scientific literacy. I think it's important for people to know a little bit about science as they go about life, but who am I to judge? The point is that this is something that people are writing textbooks, thousands upon thousands of them, that school children, university students, and teachers now learn and talk about as if it's sensible or reasonable. And it really infuriates me, because you say that Pluto's not a planet, it's a dwarf planet. So a dwarf planet, even though it has planet in it, isn't just a variety of planet, it's lesser than a planet. Oh, and by the way, in 2006, less than 5% of the voting members of the IAU actually were present even to vote on the matter. Why is this even sticking? Why has this not been revised? And again, this comes to politics. Now, many people, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, among others.
Oh yeah, we voted. We
elite planet people.
We
have received this kind of attack on them. We want Pluto back.
Dr. Tyson, he's responsible for the demotion of Pluto from planetary status. I liked Pluto. Ergo, I do not like you.
And of course, a lot of people who criticize it don't necessarily know that much about astronomy or planetary sciences. And they just feel intuitively, Pluto was a planet. Why is it not a planet anymore? That is odd. And they should feel like, hey, I want some more information here. Help me make some sense of this. And they hear the gobbledygook of, it's around the sun, it's cleared its orbit. They're like, okay. And then just, what are they supposed to do if they don't know a little bit more about that? But in any case, so Neil deGrasse Tyson, when he's pressed about this, he'll say, no, it's Mike Brown. It's his fault.
okay. And I was an accessory to that decision, but
Oh, you almost said crime. You almost
no,
said crime.
there are people like Mike Brown who discovered the objects in the outer solar system that forced that vote. In fact, he's guilty. In fact, his Twitter handle is called Pluto Killer. He admits it.
Who is this Mike Brown you're throwing under the bus right now?
No.
But you can hear that even Neil deGrasse Tyson, although he, for the obvious political, again in the broad sense, reason of wanting to kind of maintain the party line.
But I actually didn't demote Pluto. That was a vote of the International Astronomical Union.
If ifs and buts were candy and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas.
He wants to keep things as unconfusing as possible. But when you hear him talk, he's saying that, hey, this is really because Pluto should be in a class of Kuiper Belt worlds, of Kuiper Belt objects, and not to be considered the same thing as the terrestrial inner bodies. Absolutely. Of course, I agree. That has to do with their formation. It also has to do with their composition.
So now we have the gas giants, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Jupiter is more bigger compared to Earth than Earth is compared to Pluto. Okay? I don't know how else to conjugate those verbs in that sentence. So in other words, if we're on Earth saying we're big enough to be a planet, but Pluto isn't, then imagine what Jovians could be saying. They're saying the solar system has only 4 planets: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and everything else is just debris.
And even right there, Neil deGrasse Tyson points out that, hey, it's not just about size, because from the Jovian world's perspective, all of the inner planets like Earth and Kuiper Belt objects, none of them should be considered true planets as a kind of thought experiment. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson is fantastic. What he's done for communicating science through Cosmos, through his books, is fantastic. And I'm pretty sure he knows, since he is a very good writer and very good with language, that the language of this definition is completely nonsensical and utterly stupid. It needs revision. It badly needs revision. And someone who's done that is the very same primary investigator of the New Horizons mission, which passed through the Plutonian system, Alan Stern.
People say, what defines a planet? And of course, it's a really vague...
So actually, there's a really good physical definition. It's called the Geophysical Planet definition.
Yeah.
And it's very simple. It says a planet is an object in space that's large enough to be rounded by its own self-gravity. Categorization is important. Now, about this gravitational criteria, we don't require that stars control their zones in galaxies, for example. Nowhere else in astronomy is there any definition that was specifically engineered to limit the number of objects to something that you can memorize.
Yeah.
It's very anti-scientific if you think about it. But it is important that we as planetary scientists, and I know you're an astrophysicist, but in planetary science, we need to understand which objects are and are not the central topic of our field.
Sure.
And we want a definition that works.
In 2017, this fantastic paper was published in the Journal of Lunar and Planetary Science. And this paper gives the definition of a planet as a substellar mass body that has never undergone nuclear fusion and that has sufficient self-gravitation to assume a spheroidal shape adequately described by a triaxial ellipsoid regardless of its orbital parameters. There is a lot of genius in this, especially its simplicity. The idea is that it's a world, it's a round body, and it's big enough to be spherical. What this does is it allows all of these worlds to be considered planets, which fits an intuitive definition. And also, by the way, includes Earth's moon. And you'd be like, no, the moon can't be a planet. That's crazy talk. Well, I know, yeah, the moon, it can't be the moon, which its name, of course, being Luna. Luna can't be a planet, not like Endor. Oh, wait, Endor is actually a gas giant. And the forest moon of Endor, that's the moon. That's the planet. That's an intuitive definition. You see that? You think planet, right? And you think it's a planet because it looks like a planet. Well, it can be a moon and a planet. Those definitions don't have to be exclusive. And don't forget that Yavin is the gas giant, and Yavin 4, that's where the rebel base is. So the purpose of this definition is to say that it's bigger than just an asteroid and not a star. A star has undergone some form of nuclear fusion, whether currently or in the past. So brown dwarfs, stars, they're not planets. What this means is actually something rather beautiful and miraculous. It means there are about 100 planets in our solar system. And why is that relevant? It's relevant because it changes our perception. So I am very much in favor of this geophysical definition of a planet. The link, by the way, to the paper is in the description. It's a very short paper, by the way. It's only a page and a half. So think about the possibilities. 100 worlds in our solar system, 100 planets, each one of them fascinating and worth exploring. I mean, just look at Pluto. Look at this thing. It has 4 moons, a huge moon, and in fact, it's really better described as a double planet system because they orbit a point which is outside of the surface of Pluto. You may know that the Earth and the Moon, they don't orbit or rotate around the very center of the Earth, but a point which is slightly outside of the Earth's core. Now, differently with the Plutonian system, so they orbit around a common point, and that's a way that we can define a double planet system. The moon of Jupiter, Io, is the most active volcanic body in the solar system today, much more than the Earth. Volcanic plumes spewing out of its surface every single day. It is a miraculous place. Europa, just past Io, an icy moon with an ocean underneath, deeper than any on the Earth. Titan, Saturn's moon, bigger than Earth's moon, Luna. This world, this planet, has a thick atmosphere, thicker than the Earth's. It has mountains. It rains. It doesn't rain water, though. It rains hydrocarbons. These worlds are fascinating. These worlds are geophysically, geologically treasure troves of endlessly fascinating, interesting places to explore and things to learn about just this solar system and then, therefore, the whole universe. And in the public conscience, if we say, oh, Pluto's not a planet, it's not worth it. That's what it sounds like to people. And that's why I think it is useful. Just for the same reason that I think it's worth calling Scots a language, I think it's worth exploring the geophysical definition of a planet. Any world which isn't a star that is able to maintain a spherical shape. This also allows us to include, by the way, rogue planets. A rogue planet which would get kicked out of the solar system, either this solar system in its past or any other star system out there, would be a rogue planet. So to conclude my little rant here, if you would like to continue to use the 2006 IAU definition of a planet, well, you should know two things. Number one, the definition excludes every single world from being a planet. According to the definition, if you don't try to make up stories or other things added to it which aren't part of the actual definition, then there are no planets, period. If you want to be a little bit more generous and understand its intent being to create a class of planets and then another class of dwarf planets, okay, that's your definition. And if you want to make that decision, then it's an arbitrary decision for you. And I'm not saying arbitrary is necessarily bad. It's just saying, hey, here's a line, and I want this line for certain reasons. Okay, just like if you decide to call Neapolitan a dialect instead of a language, what am I going to do to stop you? What I would implore, what I would hope for, is that people would know about all of this, that they would know that the IAU definition made by science. I'm going to put scientists in scare quotes because they were scientists. But they clearly weren't thinking this through according to normal scientific rigor or according to basic language. Perfectly fine if you wish to adhere to the spirit of it, to disclude Pluto. But if someone asks you whether Pluto's a planet or not, remember that dwarf planet is this arbitrary thing, and that's what we need to add. It's an arbitrary thing created for a certain purpose. These other things should be part of it. Pluto is a world fascinating and worthy of more scientific inquiry. But what do you think about this? Do you remember when Pluto was demoted in 2006? How did you feel about it? Are you okay with the spirit of this definition, with calling Pluto a dwarf planet and the other worlds planets? Or do you like the geophysical definition, which gives us 100 worlds worthy of exploration? Let me know in the comments. And thank you so much to every one of my Patreon supporters whose names you see here on the screen. We'll see you next time.